The second time Marguerite Sable's laundry hit the floor of the equipment room, I didn't bother picking it up. The first time had taught me that folding it only made her drop it again, slower, watching my face the whole way down like she was timing a stopwatch of her own. I had a stopwatch of my own. Chipped silver, a hairline crack across the crystal. My father's name scratched into the back in letters too small for anyone else to read. I pressed my thumb to it now, inside my apron pocket, and counted. 4 seconds since the jersey hit the tile. 6, 9, ghost girl's doing her weird breathing thing again, said the blonde beside Marguerite, the one who wore her family's shipping fortune the way other people wore perfume, loud and everywhere. Does she even have a pulse under all that lotion? I had unscented barrier cream on my wrists, my throat, the backs of my knees, hospital grade. I'd been buying it since I was 16, since the presentation clinic doctor had looked at 3 blank scent strips in a row and told my mother, not unkindly, that some omegas simply came in fainter than others, that I shouldn't expect much, that I should manage expectations. My mother had stopped introducing me as her daughter after that. She'd started introducing me as her oldest. 12 seconds. I bent down and gathered the jersey, the shorts, the balled-up socks that smelled like a locker room in August, and I did not look up, because looking up was what they wanted. Attention was the whole transaction. I had learned a long time ago how to be a girl nobody looked at twice, and most days that felt less like a curse and more like armor nobody could see the weight of. "She's not even scared," the blonde said. Disappointed, like I'd broken a rule of the game. "She will be," Marguerite said. Her voice had a particular register, silk drawn slow over a blade. "The tryout list goes up Friday. My cousin's on the board that decides who keeps their financial aid job and who doesn't. Careful who you bore, ghost girl." The door swung open before I could decide whether that was a threat worth flinching at, and every voice in the room simply stopped, the way conversation stops in a building when the power goes out. I didn't need to turn around to know who had walked in. Nobody on this campus needed to turn around. You felt her enter a room the way you felt weather change, pressure dropping half a second before the first drop of rain. Callan Voss did not have a locker in the women's wing. Callan Voss did not, technically, need to be in this building at all, since her name belonged to 3 athletic facilities and half the security contracts that kept them running, funded quietly through a family trust nobody asked questions about, because asking questions about the Voss family was how you learned things you couldn't unlearn. They called her the Reaper of Wexford Hall, and not as a joke. A boy from the rowing team had made a comment about her once, at a party, low enough he thought no one important would hear it. He'd transferred schools by December with a jaw that still didn't sit right. She crossed to the lost and found Bin without a glance at Marguerite's little audience, which was somehow worse for them than if she'd looked. I kept folding. 21 seconds. 22. Then she stopped. Not slowed. Stopped, the way a held breath stops, one boot still lifted an inch off the tile. Her head turned toward me, not toward the noise, not toward Marguerite's carefully arranged cruelty, but straight at the space where I stood with a stranger's damp jersey, pressed against my chest like a shield. Her nostrils flared once, slow and deliberate, and something moved behind her eyes that I had no name for yet, because I had never in my life watched anyone's face change on account of me. "Say that again," Callan said, very quietly, to no one and everyone. The room had gone so silent I could hear the vending machine humming 2 hallways over. Marguerite's smile had not dropped, exactly, but it had gone brittle at the edges, the way ice goes brittle right before it cracks clean through. I did the only thing I knew how to do under a stare that heavy. I looked down at the jersey in my hands and kept folding, Because if I didn't have something to do with my hands, I thought I might simply come apart at the seams like the loose thread on my apron, and nobody in this room deserved to watch that happen. Nothing, Marguerite said, too fast. We were just leaving. Callan didn't answer her. She hadn't looked away from me once. You, she said, 2 syllables, low, and they landed in my chest like a struck bell. What is your name? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out on the first try. 29 seconds, 30, and my father's stopwatch had never once helped me through a moment like this one. Because nothing in 6 years of counting had prepared me for the single most dangerous girl on campus crossing a locker room floor toward me like she'd finally found the thing she'd been hunting for. Wren, I managed. Wren Hale, something in her jaw unclenched, fractionally, like a fist deciding, at the last second, not to close. Wren Hale, she repeated, tasting the shape of it, and behind her Marguerite Sable's face had gone the color of old paper, because whatever Callan Voss had just caught in the air of that locker room, she was not going to be talked out of following it to the source. She did not sniff me like an animal, and she did not touch me. She stood 3 feet away, close enough that I could see the color of her eyes shift from gray to something closer to storm water, and she went very, very still, the way predators go still right before the world reorganizes itself around them. Do you know what you smell like? She asked. I don't smell like anything, I said, and I believed it, the way you believe a lie you've been told so many times it's worn a groove into you. I'm Sentinel. It's on my file. Your file is wrong. She said it the way she said everything, an absolute declarative, with no room built into it for argument, and then she turned and walked out of the locker room without another word, leaving 40 girls and 1 shredded barrier lotion and the ghost of clover and warm linen hanging in the air like something had finally, after 6 years, been let out of a locked room. Marguerite found her voice before I found mine. What was that? I didn't answer her either. I was too busy pressing my wrist to my own throat, breathing in, trying to catch whatever it was that Callan Voss had smelled on skin I'd spent 6 years convinced was blank as paper. She was waiting for me outside the equipment room an hour later, leaning against the brick with her arms crossed, and an expression that had already rearranged 3 separate passing students' walking routes to avoid her. Up close, in daylight, I understood for the first time why people flinched from her before she'd said a single word. It wasn't size, it was stillness, the specific stillness of something that has never once needed to prove it could move fast. You wear barrier cream, she said, no preamble. Hospital grade. Enough to mask a diesel truck, let alone a person. I have a condition. You have a diagnosis somebody handed you when you were 16 and scared, and you've been living inside it ever since. She pushed off the wall. She didn't come closer. And I noticed that, filed it away the way I filed every discrepancy in a ledger, a habit 6 years of invisibility had turned into instinct. Your barrier cracked today. Sweat, friction, an 8-hour shift. For about 4 seconds in that locker room, I smelled clover in full bloom and linen dried in July sun, and I have smelled a great many things in my life. Wren Hale, engineered and natural and everything between, and I am telling you, that was not the scent of a null omega. That was the scent of someone who has been suffocating herself on purpose for years. My hands had started shaking. I put them behind my back so she wouldn't see. Why would that matter to you? Because I don't like waste, she said, and because I have spent a year going through this university's financial records, looking for a pattern I could not find. And 40 minutes ago, I watched a girl who is apparently invisible to everyone in this building fold laundry with the kind of precision that told me she counts things for a living, even when nobody's paying her to. She tilted her head. Do you keep books, Ren? I stared at her. How did you know that? I didn't, she said. Now I do. And for the first time since she'd walked into that locker room, something that might, in a kinder light, have been called a smile touched the corner of her mouth. Come with me. I want to show you something, and then I want you to tell me if I'm wrong about the numbers, because everyone I've paid to look at them so far has told me exactly what I wanted to hear, and I am beginning to suspect that means they're lying. I should have said no. I had a shift in 20 minutes and a mother 3 towns over who called twice a year, and a life built entirely around not being noticed, and everything about Callan Voss was noticing, was gravity, was the kind of undertow that pulled you out past the point where you could still touch bottom. I said yes anyway. I told myself it was about the numbers. It was not about the numbers. The office she took me to sat 2 floors above the athletics complex, behind a door with no nameplate, in a suite that smelled faintly of black pepper and rain on hot pavement, a scent I would come to know as intimately as my own before the season turned. She spread 3 years of the athletics department's discretionary fund across a steel table and stood back with her arms crossed while I read. It took me 11 minutes to find the first shell company. It took me 40 more to find the pattern behind it. 3 vendor names that didn't exist anywhere but on paper. Invoices for equipment that had never shipped. Scholarship disbursements routed through an account that closed and reopened under a new name every 18 months, like something shedding its skin to avoid a trap. You found it in an hour, Callan said when I finally looked up. Her voice had gone strange, and I would learn later that strange, for her, meant something close to reverence. I have had 2 forensic accountants on retainer for 8 months. Neither of them found that. They weren't looking for it the right way, I said. You have to think like the person hiding it, not the person hired to find it. Whoever built this rotates the shell names on the same 18-month clock every time, like they're superstitious about it, or like they're following someone else's rule. Whose rule? I didn't know. I would, eventually, and it would nearly get us both killed before it was over, but standing in that office with pepper and rain in the air, and a girl the whole campus called a reaper looking at me like I'd handed her the first solid ground she'd stood on in a year, I only knew one thing for certain. I want the job, I said, whatever it is you're about to offer me. Security consultant, Callan said, forensic auditor. Whatever title keeps the dean off your back, it pays 4 times what the laundry room does, and you'll move into the west wing of the Voss house before the semester's out. Because I am not letting the only person who's found a single true thread in a year keep sleeping in a dormitory with a lock any determined idiot could pick. She said it the way she said everything, final, unreachable, by argument. Is that acceptable? It was not a question shaped like a question. It was a door held open by someone who had clearly never learned to ask twice, and I stepped through it anyway, because for the first time in 6 years, somebody had looked directly at me and seen, instead of nothing, a girl worth building a doorway for. The Voss house sat on 11 private acres at the edge of campus, behind a gate that recognized cars by transponder and people, apparently, by scent. I found that out the first night, when the sensor at the servants' entrance chimed a soft acknowledgement before I'd even reached for the intercom, as if the house itself had already decided I belonged. Inside, everything was stone and glass, and the particular hush of old money that had learned, generations back, not to announce itself. A woman named Foster met me at the door, gray-cropped hair, forearms like rope, a beta's steady, unbothered scent that read like a held door in a storm. She looked me over once, head to boots, in the assessing way soldiers look at new recruits. "You're the one who found the shells," she said. "I'm the one who folds laundry," I said, because old habits die slow. Foster's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile I'd get from her for another 3 weeks. 15 years I've run security for this family. In 15 years, I have never once seen her wait for anyone the way she waited for you to finish reading that ledger. She turned, already walking. West Wing. Second door. She had it made up this afternoon, which means she had someone drop everything to do it in 4 hours, which means you should understand what that costs her before you decide whether you want it. The room waiting for me had a window facing the orchard, a desk already stocked with the specific mechanical pencils I favored, and, sitting on the sill in a shaft of late light, a bowl of clover honey and a loaf of bread still warm enough to fog the plastic wrap. I hadn't told anyone I liked either. I asked the kitchen what you'd ordered from the dining hall this semester, Callan said from the doorway, arms crossed, watching my face with the same terrible attentiveness she'd used on the ledgers. You get the clover honey every Tuesday. Small container. You never buy the large one, even though it's cheaper per ounce. The large one doesn't fit in my bag, I said, and heard how small my voice had gone. I noticed that too, she said, and didn't explain further, and didn't need to, because I understood then that this was a woman who cataloged people the way I cataloged numbers, patiently, completely, with a kind of hunger that had nowhere else to go. That was the night I learned her scent had a name in my head before I gave it one out loud. Pepper and rain on hot steel, dark and cold and utterly hers, and every time she passed close enough for it to reach me my chest, did something complicated I didn't yet have a word for. She did not touch me for 3 weeks. She watched me eat breakfast across too much table. She corrected my grip on the pool cue in the game room, with her hands hovering an inch from mine and never once closing the distance, and I began to understand that her restraint was not indifference. It was the loudest thing about her. The house had other residents I met over those first weeks, Junie, a scholarship kid 2 years ahead of me who ran the campus papers investigations desk and had a laugh like a slammed door, adopted me on sight the way stray cats adopt the softest-looking porch. You're dating the Reaper, she said, the second week, delighted and horrified in equal measure. Do you know how many people would kill to be you right now? Also, how many people might actually try? I didn't know yet how literal that question was. The clues came slow, the way water finds a crack. A framed photograph in the East Hall of a woman with Callan's exact jaw, captioned only with dates 11 years apart, the second one final. A locked door on the 3rd floor that Foster's eyes slid past like it wasn't there. A night I woke to find Callan standing in the orchard at 3 a.m, perfectly still, staring at nothing, her scent gone sharp and bitter with something I hadn't smelled on her before, something like grief left out too long in the cold. I didn't ask. I filed it the way I filed everything, and I waited, and the waiting ended on the night Marguerite Sable's name showed up on an invoice I wasn't supposed to be able to trace back to her family at all. I found it at 11 at night, cross-referencing a shell company's registration date against a name Foster had let slip once, offhand, about a business rival who'd hated Callan's mother more than any of the family's other enemies combined. Sable Holdings. The same 18-month rotation. The same hollow vendor names. I didn't sleep. At 6 a.m, I found Callan in the kitchen, already dressed, already still in that way that meant she hadn't slept either. I need you to look at something, I said, and set the folder on the counter between us like it might go off. She read it standing up, and I watched every year of composure she owned hold perfectly steady across her face, while something underneath it went to war. Sable, she said finally. One word, flat as a closed door. Marguerite's family, I said. I cross-checked the registration filings. Her father's holding company owns 2 of the 3 shells. The third one's still anonymous, but the incorporation lawyers the same across all three. Callan set the folder down with a care that frightened me more than if she'd thrown it. "My mother died 11 months ago," she said, and her voice had gone somewhere flat and distant, a recitation worn smooth from repeating it silently to herself 1,000 times. The papers called it a car accident. I have spent every day since proving it wasn't one. Someone paid off a mechanic, someone paid off an investigator, and someone has been laundering the money that paid them both through a network I could never quite finish mapping. She looked at me, and the storm gray of her eyes had gone dark as the sky before hail. "You finished it in 6 weeks. Marguerite's father sat 2 tables down from my mother at a business dinner a month before she died and toasted her health. Callan. He killed her," Callan said. And it wasn't a question, and it wasn't quite grief either. It was something colder and more finished, a door closing on a room she'd been standing in the doorway of for 11 months. "And his daughter has been circling you since the day I brought you into this house, and I let myself believe that was jealousy when it was reconnaissance." The kitchen had gone very quiet. Outside, the orchard held its breath in the gray early light, and I understood, standing there with a folder of numbers between us like a live wire, that I had just handed the most dangerous girl on campus the last piece of a year-long hunt, and that whatever came next was not going to be gentle. It came 4 days later, at 2 in the morning, when the West Wing's fire alarm went off on a floor that had no fire. I woke to Foster's voice in the hallway, low and urgent, and the particular metallic tang of adrenaline cutting through the house's usual quiet, like a struck match. My door opened before I'd found my feet. "Someone's in the archive room," Callan said. She'd already changed into something dark and close-fitted, and there was a stillness to her now that had teeth in it. Nothing like the careful restraint she showed me over breakfast. "Stay behind me." I did not stay behind her, not exactly, because the archive room was where I'd left my working copy of the ledger, and some instinct older than fear made me follow 2 steps back instead of standing safely still. We found the door forced, the filing cabinet gutted, and a man in a security uniform that didn't match Foster's roster crouched over the open drawer with my folder already half stuffed into his jacket. He turned fast. Faster than I expected, faster than seemed fair, and the knife in his hand caught the hallway light for 1 white second before Callan was between us, her body a wall, her arm taking the line meant for my ribs instead. The sound she made was not a scream. Alphas, I would learn, rarely scream. They went silent in the exact place pain should have made noise, as if letting it out cost more than they were willing to pay. She dropped the man in the same motion that put her hand to her own side, blood already dark between her fingers, and I stood frozen for 1 endless second before every year of counting seconds under pressure finally found a use worth having. "Pressure," I said, tearing my sleeve, pressing it hard against the wound before my mind had fully caught up with my hands. "Foster. She's hit." Foster arrived at a dead run, radio already at her mouth, and the man on the floor groaned and didn't get up, and Callan's free hand found my wrist and held it there, not to stop me, but like she needed the anchor. "You're shaking," she said, absurdly, blood soaking through the sleeve under my palm. "You got stabbed protecting my folder," I said, half a laugh, half something closer to breaking. "I think I'm allowed to shake." "Wasn't the folder," she said, and her eyes had gone glassy at the edges, adrenaline and blood loss dragging her towards somewhere I didn't want to follow her alone. "Wasn't ever the folder, Wren. They got her onto the kitchen table, because the nearest hospital was 40 minutes, and Foster didn't trust the drive with the wound bleeding like it was, and a house doctor arrived in 11 minutes flat." and I sat pressed into the corner by the stove, with my father's stopwatch clenched so hard in my fist, the crack in the crystal bit into my palm, counting, the way I'd counted my whole life, because it was the only thing keeping me upright. Somewhere in the counting, her scent changed. The pepper sharpened. The rain in it turned electric. And underneath the antiseptic and the blood, I caught something I recognized without being told what it meant. Some animal certainty in my chest that said rut, adrenaline triggered, her body's oldest instinct clawing up through the wound to answer the nearness of a threat that had touched what it considered hers. "Get her out of the room," the doctor said to Foster, not unkindly. "Professional. It'll settle faster without." "No," Callan said, hoarse, eyes finding me across the kitchen with a focus that cut straight through the blood loss. "Let her stay." "Please." Foster looked between us for one long second, and then, for the first time in 3 weeks, looked away first. I stayed. I held her hand while they stitched her side, and I counted the seconds between each breath she took, and when it was over, and the doctor had gone, and Foster had carried the unconscious intruder off to somewhere I decided not to ask about, Callan lay against the pillows Foster had piled on the kitchen table like a field hospital and looked at me with her guard entirely, finally, gone. "Tell me to stop," she said, quiet, when I leaned close to check the bandage one more time, and her hand came up to rest, feather light, against my jaw. "Any of this. All of it. Tell me to stop, and I will tonight, and I will never bring it up again." My pulse was doing something violent and unfamiliar in my throat. "I don't want you to stop. Say it plain," she said. "I need it plain, Ren, because I have wanted to do this since the first 4 seconds I smelled you in that locker room, and I am not going to take anything from you that you haven't given me with your own mouth." "Kiss me," I said, and she did, careful of her stitches and not careful at all of anything else, and it tasted like copper and rain and 6 years of a hunger I hadn't let myself name. And somewhere under the kitchen's fluorescent light, my scent came up to meet hers for the first time, without a single barrier standing in the way. We told each other the rest of it slow. Over the 2 weeks it took her side to heal properly, the two of us tucked into the orchard on afternoons. The house doctor had ordered her to rest, and she'd ignored for everything except this. She told me about her mother first. Elena Voss, who had built a shipping and security empire out of a single dockside warehouse and a will nobody expected a woman to have, who had raised Callan on a doctrine plain enough to carve into stone, love is a liability, control is armor, never let anyone see the seams. "She wasn't cruel," Callan said, turning a fallen apple over in her hands without eating it. "She was scared, in the particular way people get scared when they've built something too big to lose. I spent my whole life thinking her coldness was strength. It took watching you find in 6 weeks what I couldn't find in a year to understand it was just fear wearing a nicer coat." I told her about the clinic, the 3 blank scent strips, my mother's face going carefully neutral in the way that hurt worse than anger ever could have. I told her about the barrier cream, 6 years of it, a wall-built one-morning application at a time, until I'd half convinced myself there was nothing underneath to protect. "There was always something underneath," she said, and pressed her mouth to the pulse point at my wrist. "Gentle, questioning, ask me," I said, understanding the question before she voiced it. "Will you let me smell you the way you actually are? No cream. No wall. Just you." I peeled it back that afternoon, in the orchard, layer by careful layer, until clover and sun-warmed linen rose up around us both, like something finally allowed to bloom after a long false winter, and Callan Voss, the most dangerous girl on campus, buried her face against my throat and breathed me in like a woman who had been thirsty a very long time and had just found water. It didn't last. It was never going to last that easy, not with Sable Holdings still circling and a dead mother's ledger still open on a desk 2 floors up, and the outside world came for the softness we'd built the way it always does, without knocking. Marguerite requested a formal disciplinary hearing 11 days later, filed under my name, alleging that the financial aid office's newest security consultant had falsified vendor records to embezzle scholarship funds for her own benefit. She had, I would learn afterward, spent 3 sleepless nights building a folder that mirrored mine almost exactly, transposing names, planting a doctored signature of my own on 2 of the fraudulent invoices, turning the very evidence I'd found into a noose sized for my neck. "She's smart," Callan said, reading the formal complaint with her jaw tight enough to ache. "She built it to survive a surface read. If the board doesn't dig, you lose your aid, your consultant contract, and your enrollment in that order before lunch." "Then we make them dig," I said, and my voice only shook a little. But the hearing wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it came the morning before, when campus security found my dormitory room, the one I still technically held, for appearances tossed and empty, my backup drive gone, and a note left on the desk in handwriting I didn't recognize that said, simply, "Some ghosts should stay quiet." I stood in the doorway of that ransacked room with my whole chest gone cold and hollow, every callback of the last 2 months, the honey, the mechanical pencils, the pepper and rain scent that had started to feel like home, suddenly very far away. And for the first time since the locker room, I let myself wonder if I had been a fool to believe any of it could survive contact with people who had. Money enough to make evidence disappear. Callan found me there 20 minutes later, and the look on her face when she saw the room was not the stillness I'd grown to trust. It was the reaper the campus had named her for, cold and total, and for one terrible second I understood exactly how someone could break a jaw at a party and never once raise their voice doing it. "They took your backup," she said. "Not all of it," I said, and heard how thin my voice had gone. "I kept a second copy somewhere they'll never think to look." She turned to me sharp with something that, on anyone else, I'd have called hope. The hearing convened at 9 the next morning, in the same paneled room the university used for expulsions. 3 board members and a dean who had clearly already decided which way this would go. Marguerite seated at the front with her father's lawyer beside her and an expression of practiced, sorrowful patience, like a woman forced by conscience to report a friend's betrayal. I stood when they called my name and felt every barrier lotion I'd ever worn peel away for the last time, because there was nowhere left to hide behind. "Miss Sable's complaint alleges falsified records," the dean said. "Miss Hale, do you have a response?" "I do," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, steady the way numbers are steady, unarguable once you've shown your work. "I'd like to submit an unredacted copy of the same ledger, time-stamped and notarized 11 days before Miss Sable's complaint was filed, cross-referenced against her father's holding company's incorporation filings, which I believe the board will find match the shell structure exactly. I'd also like to submit an audio recording, obtained legally on university grounds, of Miss Sable discussing the doctored signature with the man who broke into the Voss residence and stabbed the woman seated behind me while attempting to recover the original." The room went very still, the particular stillness of people realizing, all at once, they've badly misjudged the shape of the trap they walked into. Marguerite's composure held for almost 4 full seconds before it didn't. "That recording is inadmissible, it's admissible," Callan said, standing, and every head in the room turned toward her, the way heads always turned toward her, gravity finding its center. "Because I own the security contract for this building, which means I own the right to authorize its own surveillance, which the university's council signed off on in writing 11 months ago, when my mother's estate first funded that system's installation." Check the file. My name is on it." The dean checked the file. His face went the color of the paneling. It took 11 minutes for the board to strip Marguerite of her seat and refer the recording to the district attorney's office, and it took another 9 for 2 officers to appear at the back of the room and ask her, with a gentleness that felt almost cruel given what was coming, to step outside with them regarding an active investigation into the death of Elena Voss. Marguerite Sabel did not go quietly. She stood, chair-scraping, and turned on me with a look I recognized immediately because I had worn a version of it myself for 6 years, the look of someone realizing the story they'd told themselves about their own untouchability had just come apart in public. "You have no idea what my family will do to yours," she said, low, meant only for me. "I don't have a family left to threaten," I said, and it came out steadier than any sentence I'd said in that room so far, because it was, finally, entirely true. "You should have checked that too." She was led out between 2 officers, and the silence she left behind her had a different texture than the silence she'd walked in with, lighter, like a held breath finally released. Callan crossed the room to me before the dean had finished stammering an apology neither of us cared to hear. Her hand found mine in front of the whole board, the whole hearing, every eye that had ever slid past me in a hallway, now fixed entirely and only on the space where our fingers laced together. "I want to do this properly," she said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, though I don't think either of us particularly cared who else did. Not the hearing, not the ledger. You in front of people who'll remember it. "Do what?" I said, though I already knew, my pulse climbing towards something that felt less like fear now and entirely like hope. "Ask you," she said, "with your words, whether you'll let me claim you. Properly, bond and all. I have wanted to since a locker room 3 months ago, and I have made myself wait because I needed you to choose it with a clear head, not a grateful one, and I don't have a clear head left to wait with any longer." "Ask me then," I said. She did, right there in the paneled room, on one knee that had nothing to do with the injury still healing at her side. Her voice pitched low and rough and entirely without its usual armor. "Ren Hale, will you let me claim you? Will you let me be the last thing standing between you and every person who ever told you you were nothing to smell, nothing to want, nothing to keep?" Her thumb ran once, deliberate, across my knuckles. "Tell me to stop, and I will. Tell me yes, and I will spend the rest of my life proving you were never a ghost to anyone who was paying attention." The dean, the board, the 2 remaining board members who hadn't yet fled the room's sudden and unbearable intimacy, all of them faded to nothing at the edges of my vision. "Yes," I said, and the word came out on a breath that smelled, for the first time in 6 years, entirely and unashamedly like clover in full bloom. She claimed me that night, in the orchard, under a claiming so gentle it barely felt like the violent, ancient thing the biology books described, her teeth at my throat only after 3 separate murmured checks against my skin. "Are you sure? Tell me if this hurts. Say my name if you need me to stop." And I said her name each time, not to stop her, but because I wanted the shape of it in my mouth while the bond between us settled into place like something that had always belonged there and had simply been waiting, patient as a locked room, for someone to finally open the door. The district attorney's case against Marguerite's father closed 9 months later with a conviction that put him away for longer than I'd been alive. The paper trail I'd built standing up in court exactly the way it had stood up in that hearing room, unshakable. Because numbers, unlike people, don't know how to lie convincingly under pressure. Marguerite herself took a plea, 3 years, her family's fortune gutted by restitution orders and legal fees, until the Sable name meant considerably less on campus than it once had. The blonde who'd mocked my breathing in the locker room transferred schools by spring, the same way that boy from the rowing team once had. And I found I felt nothing sharper than a distant, settled quiet when I heard about it, the particular piece of a ledger finally, fully balanced. Junie got the exclusive on the whole story for the campus paper and dedicated the byline, only half joking, to the ghost who turned out to have the loudest scent on record, which became, against my will, an affectionate nickname the entire West Wing adopted within a week. Callan proposed properly the following spring, no hearing room this time, just the orchard at dusk with the apple trees in full bloom and a small velvet box that had belonged, she told me, to a grandmother she'd never met but had heard described as the one Voss woman who'd married for love instead of leverage. Foster stood witness at the wedding 6 months after that, gruff and dry-eyed until the vows themselves, at which point she made a sound suspiciously like a sob and denied it flatly for the rest of the evening. My mother did not come. I found, standing at the altar with clover and rain-slicked steel mingling in the evening air around us, that I did not need her to. A year on, the West Wing smelled permanently of honey and warm bread, and the locked door on the 3rd floor had finally been opened, its contents, Alana Voss's final case files, closed at last, packed away in a room Callan and I built together for exactly that purpose. A room for grief that had somewhere proper to live instead of haunting orchards at 3 a.m. We kept a jar of the same clover honey on the counter, out where anyone could see it, because Callan had decided, somewhere in that first difficult spring, that nothing in our house would ever again need to hide behind a wall to be safe. On the morning I write this down, the orchard light comes in low and gold across the kitchen table, the same table where a doctor once stitched a wound meant for me, and my father's stopwatch sits stopped on the windowsill where I finally, deliberately, let it run down for good, because I no longer need to count the seconds until something goes wrong. I know now what it means to be seen entirely, scent and scar and every quiet year I once mistook for nothing at all, and I know that the girl the whole campus once swore would destroy me turned out, in the end, to be the only person who ever looked at me and refused to let me disappear. Being invisible was never the truth of me. It was only the longest lie I'd been asked to wear, and it took one locker room, one caught breath, one girl who refused to stop looking, to finally take it off for good. The end.